generation of tools. It's really built to make cybersecurity easier. So, CJ, we got to talk about Germany and we got to talk about all the great stuff CompTIA is doing. We forgot to talk about CIS controls. We're going to do that today.
I'm very confident then in our success to this conversation.
Well, welcome back, everyone, to the MSP Cyber Roundtable. Chris Johnson, fresh off the road, actually still on the edge of the road, with us to talk about this refresh that happened in the last couple of months, CIS Controls 8.1. Before we jump into that, you've been on the road pretty much since April, right? Like pretty nonstop.
Maybe not quite that extreme, but definitely since July.
July, okay. And fresh back from Germany and um, London for EMEACon, and I didn't ask any questions, but like new takeaways, exciting things. Like what's new in EMEACon this year?
Having Todd Thibodeau give his keynote on, I think it was Tuesday morning, he highlighted, sort of the roadmap for CompTIA, particularly on the product certification side. And it was really interesting to hear. Maybe for those that didn't hear it if they weren't at ChannelCon, it was a little bit of a repeat, but for valid reasons, obviously different part of the world. But he talked about some of the goals, and there's one, well, two very specific trajectories that I think are really important. Number one, as career paths are formed, whether it's out of high school or career changes, or maybe just not even to know how to leverage what you've done from a school standpoint, the launch of what we're calling the lowercase a. So like A plus is a prominent certification within CompTIA. Most people know about at least A plus, and if and maybe a little bit on a lesser scale, Network Plus. Those are very popular. And the idea here is that the lowercase letter puts into sort of motion like the idea behind a much smaller condensed version to kind of find out if this is something you might be interested in. Helps kind of like on a micro scale give you some of that trajectory. And then the flip side of that is to start adding in some of our mastery courses. So Security X as opposed to Security Plus, CISA Plus, and I think there's another one in there that they are transitioning the name altogether that will be tied to sort of that X factor of more of an expert level, which I think is really important because I think that a lot of us understand the certifications that are out there, and I don't mean that just to say CompTIA, but we don't know where they sit unless you're one that has taken the course, right? Like, there's no like, hey, I wonder what it means to have that cert. Is that like you went to high school and you got some sort of like diploma, or is it you went to post-secondary master's programs and PhD programs to sort of see that? So I think it's great to sort of have, even if it's CompTIA focused, to recognize that just because you have moved into the industry that you're in, you've got the work experience, 5+ years, et cetera, doesn't mean that you've stopped continuing your education, even if it's not traditional. And to be able to have some sort of standardized measurement of that, I think is a pretty big deal.
I um I was there at ChannelCon when Little A was announced.
Sure.
I actually got way more excited than is reasonable. Um,
Fair.
and I wanted to know more. I was like, "Tell me more,"
Right.
but there was no more yet because it was the announcement. But so just for people who haven't been keeping track, CompTIA was, I guess you'd call it entry level professional certification, and then expanded into intermediate up towards expert. Like that's been the last 10 years or 20 years of
Yeah.
journey. And then a few years ago, we added secondary education, right,
Yes.
for the K-12 market. which was it felt like what is CompTIA doing at that moment? But now that I see, well, actually, now we have little a, or it's little all the letters, right? Because we
Yeah.
have multiple starter intros. Now we have a complete story arc, right? Where we're starting out in secondary ed. We've got that intro to professional tracks. Then we have the professional certifications up
Yep.
towards expert, and now we're adding more expertise at the top of the arc. And so it's full career arc now. That's the vision,
Yeah,
right?
and things like apprenticeship programs and that kind of thing that I think really help drive home the idea that yes, there might be a shortage of positions being filled, or sort of a shortage of qualifications in the job market. But I think we've also seen that it isn't necessarily that there aren't people out there to fill those positions. It's combination of skill set needing to be acquired and the hiring side needing to be a little bit more open to the idea that what if you got somebody that's not there yet, but you can train them, and that there are resources to bring their skill level up to where you need it to be, I think is far more powerful and quite honestly a better fit for most organizations that can invest the time than to just say, I put a job posting out there, hired somebody, had to pay that level of what they're worth, and I got one of them, versus I could have hired 2, maybe 3 that were not at that level, but I can train them in the way we do things and get them the skill set that they need to grow. I don't know, I think there's definitely a shift happening in the market.
So, yeah, I can tell you've been really like career trajectory focused since you've joined CompTIA. you you you're a good brand rep, but you
Yes,
were there. You're part of communities, right? So,
I am.
what's new in communities as well, or recently new, I should say.
So the big thing on the community side, I think, is this energy around the community being where you are. So that might be more of my own internalization of what it's supposed to mean, but like I think CompTIA and the community side is starting to get asked more frequently to participate in somebody else's conversation. And I think that's huge because at the end of the day, our goals in community is, retention and recruitment is a big deal for us in membership. But I think when you do that in sort of this like siloed, maybe a little bit of the blinders on, you get caught up on the value that we're trying to convince a MSP or a vendor to come and participate at something that we're doing. But we already have that happening, and the desire for a vendor who's putting on an event to say, "Hey, we would really like you guys to be there. Here's the reasons why," is super exciting, and definitely a shift in what we're seeing. The other thing I would say that's happening is, from a community standpoint, is this recognition that communities are only as good as the participation that you get, and sometimes it's easier to uh, lose sight of the fact that there are other communities out there. And recently, through SMBIT and Tech Tribe and ConnectWise's Evolve, and then the connections through obviously CompTIA and others like MSP Ignite and PAX 8 peer groups, there's this desire to say, well, what happens when we start doing things together, like bring more than one community into the same space? What can we achieve then? And I think we're at the beginning stages of that. We're starting to see like SMBIT, or not SMBIT. Well, they did too. So SMBIT is having an event right now. They're having theirs, but we just had I think it was Tech Tribe just had their event in Vegas. But there's this growth that's driving events that's not tied to the traditional, like, we're a big vendor and we're hosting an event and there'll be other vendors there. So come join us. So I think we're seeing a shift in this. We want to collaborate and network on a larger scale than the reason we go to a traditional event is to do those things. We're now going to events where that's the premise behind those events.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's why I go to events, so that makes sense.
Right? Like, I mean, and obviously if there's a good, closing party, I mean, those are starting to take place at a level that says, well, I was gonna maybe not go, but I heard that such and such is going to be the closing headliner. And you're like, well, maybe the 150 to however much it might cost me to be there might justify the okay, I'm going, right? Like, so there's definitely a lot of different approaches now to getting people to events. And I think it's definitely an interesting time to be going to events. I think you definitely have to get somewhat choosy this time around than what you would have traditionally 4 or 5 years ago.
All right, well, we could keep talking events because I know you really got
We could, because I mean,
you've
this
got
is
your finger on the pulse.
this might be specifically tied to CIS. I think it is. I
Well,
think
all right, well,
good segue.
before we go into CIS,
Yeah.
before we go into topic of the day, I actually have a lecture today. So we didn't talk about it, but feel free to contribute. I'm gonna jump right in.
All right.
So, the first thing you do when you Google irreversible encryption is you find like these posts of people on the internet saying there's no such thing as irreversible encryption. Like that's the whole point of encryption is to be able to get your data back, which is actually not true. Um, Encryption's been around for thousands of years, but since we've really entered the digital realm, um, we have this concept of reversible encryption, which is the old school. We want to keep something secret, right? We
Yeah.
want to keep it safe in transport, or recently in computers, safe at rest, right? But we also have irreversible encryption, and we use that for some interesting applications that people sometimes don't always associate with cryptography, which is um, eh, non-repudiation or verification of identity. So making sure we
Certainly.
understand that data hasn't been changed, right? Making sure that the person who gave us this data like is the person that we think they are, right?
Right.
And you can even use it to prove that someone said something when they don't. Maybe they decide later they want to take it back, and you could say, "Aha! I have proof because of
Yeah.
crypto," right? And that's where we have blockchain, right?
Right.
So irreversible encryption is also a thing. So I just want to talk about those two use cases because that's really the differentiation here. So normal encryption, you got plain text, you apply some kind of cipher. I won't go into deep into ciphers today. What you end up with is encrypted text. It looks like random binary gobbledygook. You can't do anything with it. It's not even legally considered to be whatever was unencrypted. So if you lose encrypted data, as long as the keys are stored separately, that's not really considered data leakage. Um, and then you apply the key and the cipher, and then you're able to decrypt the data back to its original form. So that's reversible encryption. And then you get the,
Right.
the irreversible encryption, which um, sounds a little funny. Why would you want that? But basically, you apply a math function to your original data, and what you get is a value. You get a value that usually less data than you put in the function.
Right.
So
This kind of gets into things like redacted data, or you see this with when the bad guys over encrypt something, they encrypt the encrypted data, and now it's not recoverable because they can't. There's no path backwards.
yeah, so I mean, there's, but this is on purpose, right? We encrypt
Right.
it
The first
because
one on purpose. Yeah.
while there may not be a way to get the data back, there are use cases for a irreversible encryption. So, um, just to clarify, reversible encryption, we use that in transit, which usually means for most of us, it's secure web browser traffic. It's HTTPS
Right.
TLS encryption, but also all of our encrypted messengers, right, are hopefully encrypting on the wire. We've
Right.
got protocols like SSH, PGP, GPG, etc. Lots of other examples, right? Um, Mostly what we're seeing in transit encryption these days is really TLS wrapped around all sorts of protocols, right?
Right.
Um, and then at rest encryption. So that's the other encryption we you normally think of, a file. That's the one you brought up, right? So in this case, the attackers, um, encrypting. But ideally, we also encrypt our own devices so that if we lose them and people don't have access to the key, we don't have to worry, right? Um, but then there's the irreversible applications. So, people get there's these uh, I don't know if everyone here hasn't been at Have I Been Pwned yet, the website, right? Like, go, go type in your name and email address there and see what comes up. But the reason why the first application of irreversible encryption I was aware of was in um, password files, right? We used to have these password files which would store the passwords in them so that you could
Sure.
authenticate who is logging into a system. But we haven't. Best practice since really the late '80s has been we should probably cipher these so that if someone captures that password file, they can't, log in as everyone in our system. And so we use a one-way function, right, where we know what the password looks like after it goes through the function, but we don't actually know what it looks like before it goes through the function. So as from a
Sure.
server perspective, you can still validate the after, right, without knowing the before. So
Right. It helps with making those hash keys not very usable in the wrong hands.
yeah, and the reality is password files are like, um, I mean, these days usually encrypted, but it's also one of the first targets that an attacker's looking at. And
Yeah.
if anyone is either storing their passwords plain text, which hopefully you're not, or maybe you think you used a one-way function but you didn't follow best practice. Attackers are looking for those opportunities. But we also see
Right.
these in digital signatures. So we're using irreversible encryption around like signed executables, signed patches, smart contracts, right? Um, and of course, the various checksums we use to validate like is a file, you know, is the contents of this file what we think it is, right? When we publish those SHA or MD5
Sure.
sums. And I want to bring up one more, which people may not be aware of. We use the same technology in barcodes. So, as part of, and this is like the first application, and this maybe in my career, I probably encountered this before I encountered anything else really, which is, if you, from those days of the old striped barcodes, right? The last digit or the last couple of digits were check digits. We use the same technology in credit card numbers, where we add a digit or two on the end. And the point is, we can tell if the rest of the number is accurate because if you feed that number into an algorithm, a number pops out the end, and um, with
Basically, the
fairly good,
formula doesn't lie.
yeah, you can make sure the barcode hasn't been damaged, right?
Right.
All
Which
right,
which we often see in bad barcodes, right? If it bleeds.
yeah, I mean, or they get taped over or whatever.
Sure.
Um, yeah, or these days you got the QR codes with all the little dots, and like,
I was just
how do
thinking
you know
about
that?
that,
Like,
like, yeah, and that's one of the things that makes it different, right? Barcodes have the indicators on them. They usually have that information printed on the barcode to give you some sense of truth that it is a valid barcode versus a QR code that's like all those little squares inside the square look like they're good squares.
yeah, and they actually use an algorithm, and they don't necessarily classify it as encryption, but it is it's a mathematical one-way function that they put that QR code data through
Sure.
in the exact same way we're doing it for file integrity to make sure that that barcode's like a solid barcode, right?
Right.
All right, so CIS 8.1. Um, I was super excited when this came out, um, and then I went and dove in and did not immediately. My excitement deflated a little bit because it's the same as CIS 8, um, with some
They didn't
qualifications.
take
But basically,
anything out.
they didn't change a single ID number. They didn't add a single control. The spirit of every control stayed the same, and they didn't change the implementation groups. So the same old CIS, but then you dig a little bit deeper, and they did some really cool stuff that, in
They
addition
did.
for a few years. Um, CJ, I think you may because of what you've been doing with the Trustmark, you're probably on the detail side more knowledgeable of this than I do. But with the thing that I got really excited about was the new asset classes. What are the things that you encountered there?
So it's funny you say the asset classes. So one of the things that we had when building the Trustmark was this futuristic hope that was partially tied to what we knew was going to happen with NIST CSF version 2, where they were adding in governance. And we're like, The Trustmark was built, and one of the things that was missing out of the frameworks that we wanted to use out of the gate was we used CIS Top 18 was really the core foundation, and it didn't have governance in the traditional sense of like how to go about doing this. So I think that at the high level, when we look today at what took place with CIS Top 18 version 8.1 is uh, context, coexistence, and consistency that were added into the equation that really, I think, bring to light the pieces that were missing. So you have it brought up on the screen, but one of the pieces that is not in this asset class is the documentation, right? Like this is the old one,
Oh
correct?
yeah, we have I got it right here, man. And they expanded out a lot of the verbiage first of all.
They
But
did, but we say this a lot. We say this literally all the time. Like, if you see the language in the safeguard that says something to the existence of like you need to have a program or a plan or to right, those are good indicators that it's implying that there's documentation, and documentation is one of the new asset classes, right, under governance.
yeah. So, they added documentation as it's as a security asset, like, this is part of your
Right,
security this is a
right.
company it's a thing in the company that's worth value, right? That you can theoretically, you could put a dollar amount on, but more importantly, it's something you need to keep track of. It's part of your security, sphere, right?
Yeah,
Um,
I mean, and to add some clarity, so the context part, I think the easiest takeaway was that they're talking about to provide greater detail. Like, so the frameworks that are out there when it comes to CIS, they're not islands, right? So CIS is notorious for like how they built the framework to begin with was looking at other frameworks. They weren't just, building this and saying, we don't care what else is out there. We're going to build this in a vacuum and people will recognize and apply it. And version 8.1, I think with the wait time that we had from version 8 to 8.1 is largely tied to the timing of the release of NIST CSF version 2. And the results of NIST CSF version 2 and being released sort of triggered the okay, now is the time to release this to help with that context component because prescriptive nature of most frameworks is not very great. It's not great. So the addition of greater detail, cost, of course, we covered that one, and the practicality and the clarity of what's in there. Like, what does this mean to my organization? And I think we're seeing that the recognition already of like what's sort of the precursor to version 9. We're not that far away, I think, from what they know needs to come out in version 9 based on just what we've seen in here. Governance, I think, is going to play a I don't want to say it's gonna play a bigger role. I'd hate to put
well, they
words in.
they
Yeah,
labeled
go
them
ahead.
all these governance safeguards, right? Which
Yes,
they didn't have governance safeguards before, right?
correct.
It was NIST 5 functions that they were drawing from, and when
Yeah,
NIST said, "Oh, there's this function called governance," and mostly what they
right,
did in CSF is they took safeguards that were already there, and they said, "No, that's
right,
not detect, that's govern. No, that's not recover, that's govern," right?
right.
And they added a couple new things, and CSS followed along and did the same thing, right? So,
And
um,
that's the coexistence piece, right? Like the mappings of what happened with NIST CSF version 2 required them to add some level of context here for the coexistence to work, they had to add some context, right? It just wasn't going to be very user friendly for those going through this if there wasn't oh, well, and this CSF has added all these things. What does the crosswalk look like now that they've added a whole entire new domain category?
yeah, well, and CIS, this isn't just for 8.1. Over the last 3 years, they've like churned out like a machine crosswalks between
Oh,
I think there's
game
more
changing.
CIS there's more official CIS crosswalks to other frameworks than there are with coming from any of the other standards bodies. So NIST used to be the king there, and I think they've lost
Right.
their crown to CIS.
I don't know that they've lost their crown. I think it's a different approach. So I think that NIST CSF version 2 and even version 1 is that legacy model that goes back to the late 90s, early 2000s when it comes to safeguards, prescriptive nature that over time have become what used to fill up an entire page of a cell information of prescriptive implement these things to like you decide, but it should have some gobbledygook and they don't really give you a whole lot of information. I think CIS is bringing some of that back with a focus on the security side of this because let's be honest, most frameworks are not focused on security, they're focused on privacy. And when we go down that path, not only are they focused on the privacy of a particular data type, but they're only focused on a particular data type. And CIS is saying that we're not here to tell you what data you should classify as sensitive or protected or important. But here's the general idea of how data should be in general protected. Now, as you go forward, do that from a security standpoint across those data categories versus like, oh yeah, we're telling you PCI data far more important than other data. And I think that's important because depending on what your business does, you may or may not have interactions with all of those data types at the same level that would require you to go and build your entire security best practices around those frameworks.
Well, that is important. I know when I do assessments, if you look at the foundations, right, like foundational things that need to be in a cybersecurity program, data governance is almost always the weakest in every organization, and
Sure.
it's some of that is legacy because of what you just said. They are in the retail industry. They only care about PCI DSS, and because they care so much about PCI DSS, they've
Yeah.
literally ignored every other type of data. Right? You see this in
Your
defense
credit card might not
contractors
get
that only
compromised,
care about
but
CUI.
yeah,
Right?
exactly. That's
um,
very true. And I
now,
and also the selfishness that comes with it, right? So like you brought up a good one, CUI, like if the data got destroyed, as long as it didn't get into the wrong hands, probably not such a big deal, but if you had the data get into the wrong hands and it's the data that they care about, versus as an organization, well, I should be caring about all the data that's pertinent to either my employees or my clients. And I think that's a very big fork in the road for especially the MSP space, knowing that you're providing services to clients that don't all fall into the same category of what's important. But as an MSP following something like CIS Top 18, or obviously as I would like to say, the Trustmark, it focuses on the data itself is important, regardless of what kind of data it is. It's just a question of how important it is to either you or the client.
so there was another big area of changes, and this one's hard to show visually, but I just have blocks of text here on the screen.
Perfect.
And if we were to channel Mr. Matt Lee for a moment here, who is super into punctuation and really like precision, right?
Right.
Precision when it comes to the definitions of these controls. Um, there was a lot of there were some vagaries in there in CIS before, right?
Yes. More
And
than a
as an
few.
implement and as an implementer with a long history in cybersecurity who has read thousands of pages of cybersecurity reference material, I didn't need the clarity because I was making the reference. Oh, this sentence here is referencing an entire 1,000-page book I read.
You could
I know the
infer.
theory behind that,
Yeah.
but I think most implementers, right? They just want to know. Well, just tell me what to do, right?
And that's
So
been largely the Matt Lee approach, right? Like, what is it that I'm being asked to do? We've played an entire game around this. And I think one of the pieces that's largely been missing is frameworks shouldn't be written to the implied, right? Like, I shouldn't be telling you that here's the prescriptive approach to solving for this safeguard, but then leaving enough information out that says you can truly come up with your own interpretation. We've been doing this for far too long. We've seen that with other frameworks where we leave the way like we see this with NIS too, right? Where the requirement or the due date that comes out, I think yesterday, right? I think it was today or yesterday, is that here's the 20 countries, here's NIS2, each country go and come back with how you plan to interpret and implement this control set. And I think that's largely problematic because if you can't collectively agree on what the implementation should look like, then I would argue that the way in which you've approached sharing with me what I should be doing hasn't been clearly defined.
So I was working with someone on version 8 this morning. Um, and I'm already seeing the differences here. And I looked at the change log previously, and I've been digging into this, but I'm seeing, there's small changes, right? But it's like, here's an example. This description here, um, it tells you exactly what to do. Here's your choices, right? Make sure there's a process too. You have to do this thing or this thing or this thing or this thing, right? Instead
Right.
of just address unauthorized assets. Like, what does address mean, right? So
So yeah, that's a good point.
I think that's while it may not be super visible, when you're down in the trenches trying to implement this stuff, I think those things matter a lot. Um, so uh we could take a left turn into NIST 2 for a moment here. So I've been watching that train run here, CJ, for the last couple of months. Um, People are getting I know they published over a year ago right now, right? The first draft was
You're talking about NIS too, right?
NIS 2, yeah.
Yeah, it's
So
been a little over a year.
for the first half of the year, like no one knew what that was.
Sure.
Then there was some knowledge in the industry, um, and now I'm hearing more people say the words, but it's clear to me they haven't actually read it yet, right? So, you just came from a MIACOM, right? So, and the UK is driving this, right? So,
Sure. Well, no,
expect
not the UK, the
they're
EU.
not EU's driving it. Okay,
EU is driving
so
NIS too. So this is that separation between UK with their NCSC and Cyber Essentials and the EU with NIS too. And not that there isn't some overlap, because obviously there's overlap, but the biggest thing that I saw with, we can get into the weeds on NIS too, but one of the things I think is really important is looking at who all was involved, right? So ISO definitely was involved in what's coming about with it. But what I think is interesting is it's largely a shift in what is classified under critical infrastructure. They had, I think it was digital identity was considered a category. I might be butchering the actual name, but they added in IT service providers. And I think that's where there's a huge shift of like, well, what does that mean? What is an MSP? What do they call it? ESP, which just means external service provider. And what are the expectations? Like, does it mean that that ESP or MSP needs to meet all of these things because they fall into the category of providing support to critical infrastructure? And I think that's where some of the challenges come into play. Is, well, this has been handed out to 20 different countries, and each of those countries is supposed to come back to the table and say, "Here's how we're going to do it." Okay, that sounds crazy. If you're all part of one group governing under one identity, like how is this going to get regulated?
I don't know. We live here in the States, and we got 50 states doing things 50 different ways. So,
But
yeah,
you know what?
yeah.
I don't know if I completely I subscribe to that a little bit, but I think at the end of the day that when we look at things like safe harbor laws around PII and some of that, we've got more than a dozen states now that have pretty consistently either adopted the federal statement or the federal law, or they've added some level of additional scrutiny. And I
Y-
think when
You're
you look at
you're
states
right.
like California should be scrutinizing more. And I know there's other states that now fall into this category with, COPA, or sorry, CCPA, not COPA. But like under CCPA, like under their privacy, like if you think about the vendors that are in the Silicon Valley, versus say like, Iowa, like there needs to be additional, like they're the pioneers in what's defining potentially what we need to be doing federally and at a state level because of what's happening in those states. Like forget the politics. um, if you have vendors that have created a new technology that privacy is not the number one function in what they're doing, and it's very popular, it's no different than the conversations people are having about things like Timu and TikTok and DJI and Huawei. Like they're not wrong conversations to be having as it pertains to our own personal security and that of this country. But who's driving the legislation to help us regulate safely and to be successful in the lieu of us not doing a good job ourselves?
Well, maybe it's this is the American system speaking, right? So the way we've worked it out here is the way we have a conversation in this country, right? Is we all try a bunch of stuff, and the
Yep.
wolves eat the sheep.
Right, right.
And like and some of those concepts win and end up being preeminent. And if some people don't want to follow it, they're like, we're going to go our own way, and bad stuff might happen, and they do that sometimes. And in the EU, it sounds like what's happened is they've come up with a framework to have a civil discourse over, okay, here's the rule set of how we're going to have the conversation of how we're going to do
Sure.
things. Here's the kit. Figure it out. Let's come back with plans and we can talk about them.
And ultimately, I think that particular framework is a bad example of really the goals in the SMB space, right? So like they're expanding upon, NIS one, which was about how to support critical infrastructure. The challenge, and this is why I think it sometimes feels a little bit foreign to us here in the States, is we don't have 90% plus of the GDP being handled by the SMB businesses, right? We're less than half of that. We see the examples then in the states here is like the Cisco's and the Microsofts of the world getting penalties, and we're like, yeah, go figure, right? Like if only they did things better or in a more appropriate manner. And the reality is, we don't necessarily need more regulation here in the States. We need better education around how to improve cyber hygiene, not just for ourselves, but with our clients. Because when you do things like, hey, how to spot the deep fake in the following videos, one's fake and one's real, and you're like, oh, well, yeah, I mean, I got it wrong. Why? Because, well, looking at the video, I assumed that it was true. And when you tell me things like, well, you should see the shadows or the way lighting didn't work a certain way, and the facial expressions, and you're like, oh, they're obviously using an early generation of generative AI, not a current version, right? Like those questions and those quizzes feel like you're being um, sort of shamed for getting it wrong, when the reality is it's based on already antiquated quizzing, right? So like the reality should be like, do you know what the possibilities are that are out there? Do you know how to spot some of those? Sure. But to say that I also am going to grade you, and until you get a 5 out of 5 or a 4 out of 5, you don't pass, like I can take the same quiz an unlimited number of times. Am I actually learning something, or am I checking a box? Or for those of you that are overseas, ticking a box. But like those are the challenges that we have. We need a way to say, hey, I've put this in front of you, no different than we would do legal disclosure, right? Like I gave you the notification, you chose not to do anything with it, versus I'm grading you on whether or not you watched the 18-minute video or if you just played it on high speed and then took the quiz.
Well, this goes back to the and I maybe you're more uh maybe you can explain this or be more authoritative than I can, but I think it goes back to the discussion of is it training or education, right, that we should be pushing out. And
That's a
CompTIA is in this
great statement.
space where CompTIA is in this space, and I know you guys on the website it says training, right? But the reality is, yeah, it's training, but you don't get to claim it unless you can prove it, right? on
Right.
a test that's actually like you can't just rewind and do that question 8 times, right? Like you're back to the books and studying if you fail the test. So
Or tell me
what
why I got it wrong, right? Like what, like if I say yes as opposed to no, and then it just says to retake the test because I got one wrong, I understand not telling me what question specifically it was if you don't want me to be like, oh, well, now I know what to gotta go study. But I think there's something to the statement that says, do I want you to learn the material or do I want you to memorize it? Because we know as soon as you've memorized it, it's already starting to fade away. Yet if I give you structured exercises over time where the habits become good and constant, then you will make better decisions because you are informed and have an understanding how to approach the problem even when you don't know the answer to the problem.
Well, maybe this is an opportunity for another standard. I know
Oh boy.
in certifications we have an ISO IEC standard and an ANSI standard besides around has did someone check this person's government ID? It's like the person in the
Sure.
testing room actually the person, and is like are the test questions like actually proof of them understanding the knowledge? Like there's
Right.
actually a certification for that to make sure that the test someone took
For
is like
sure.
is and I what is it? ANAB in the US? I forget what the international, ISO number is on this, but
I don't know off
we
the top of
might
my
need
head.
something like that for IT and cyber skills training down at the corporate level of just
Got it.
like like the awareness training maybe needs to be. I mean, you're arguing for kicking it up a notch, I think.
Yes. Let's raise the bar.
Speaking of, your
Yeah.
mission is raising the bar, Trustmark. So we're just
Yes.
talking about CIS V8 and V8.1. The safeguards haven't changed. What impact is this having on the program?
I think it's great. So the impact on the program is this. By adding the governance module into the equation, it's allowing us to highlight some of those things where it was really just those participating saying, oh, well, that's governance. Oh, well, that's, fill in the blank. Now we actually have the safeguards that have governance added to them from a standards level isn't something that we have to just tell you. We can point to the fact that, hey, there's a third party organization that did this for us, and I think it's helpful because a lot of cybersecurity falls into governance, strategy. I would say governance and leadership, but governance and leadership, strategy, and then that culture. Like when those three things get into alignment, then cybersecurity becomes something that you can embrace and do, as opposed to buy and sell. Right? Like it becomes embedded into the organization, becomes a part of what you do. Even if you're not a cybersecurity company, it's you're known for by what you do. Right? So like I think it highlights those things that say, hey, we're approaching it in a way that allows you to understand that we take cybersecurity seriously because these other things are in order.
Yeah, I was having that conversation with a vendor sorry, a partner this morning, one of my partners. And we're talking about assessing where they are right now in practice with their clients and where do they want to go in the future. And I
Sure.
said, man, wouldn't it be great if you could not buy some of those products that you're buying for your clients and instead do cybersecurity yourself, right?
Right.
You could actually, for the same amount of client dollars, or maybe let fewer client dollars, right? Do more cybersecurity, take more risk off the table. And I know I'm in vendor land, but send less money to the vendors.
Right.
Keep,
Or maybe that's not even the right answer. It's get vendors to participate in making the reality what it needs to be.
yeah, figure out how to support those doing actions, right?
And I think that's one of the things that's been exciting about the Trustmark is now seeing vendors participate, not so unlike even Fort Mesa. Like there's an opportunity to have conversations with the vendors who want to see MSPs be successful. That's not directly tied to their product or the service that they deliver, but ultimately will lend itself to wanting to explore more with a vendor that's putting that kind of energy and effort in. I met with a vendor last week that one of the things that they said is they said, we would just like to be able to help participate from the education standpoint. And I'm like, this is brilliant. Like, I don't need to go and highlight how they might solve a particular safeguard or a control domain. It's that they want to provide the education and how an MSP can go about addressing that control domain. And yeah, in lieu of that, they're going to see like this was brought to you by fill in the blank vendor. I would probably go check that out.
All right. Well, you're back on the road. You got a week off, right? Then IT Nation, is
I
that right?
do. Yeah, I'll
Yeah.
be at IT Nation on Tuesday, a week from Tuesday.
Oh, I was about to say you're showing up early, man.
Yeah, man, like this like, pre-game.
uh, well, we can't pop any bubbles, but clearly we're going to
Sure.
be Evolve's probably going to be talking about those playbooks, right? And we're going to see
Absolutely.
updates there. Um,
In
what else
fact,
are
they
we
are
looking?
all done.
They're all. Can we download them today?
You can download them. I think it'll be post IT Nation. But yes, they are all
Okay.
done. I have seen all of them with the branding. So yes.
All right, they're now IT Nation branded, right? So they're the IT Nation playbooks.
They are the IT Nation playbooks mapped to the CompTIA Cybersecurity Trustmark.
Yeah, so that's really exciting, particularly when we're in this Trustmark group and we're meeting with service
Yes,
providers, and they say, "Well, how do I do these things?" Right?
right,
Or they don't ask how to do them, but clearly they're asking inside.
right,
And we're like, well, just read the control, read the safeguard, right? So having those
right,
prescriptive playbooks are particularly useful. So that'll
for
be great,
sure.
I think, for the program. Anything else new in Trustmark land?
I don't want to spill anything new other than to say that we are officially now underway with the audits happening with through the Crust certified program, and Verisprite is the auditor that is now currently going through their first one, and we're about to start the second one here shortly of MSPs going through the program where it is now moving significantly beyond the borders of CompTIA.
That's neat. Hopefully that means the velocity, right, is going to be flying. So
It means that we can do more simultaneously, that's for sure.
So I know I've been hearing from partners that have been, we had some partners that right out of the gate ran really fast, right?
Yeah.
But we had some partners that just sort of like came out walking speed, and after I think that they're reaching the finish line now, which is also really exciting. Um, so
Yes.
I heard from one a day or two ago that they haven't reached out yet, but they're almost there at the line. So.
There's a few of them. In fact, I met with some while I was in Germany and in London that are ready for their assessment. They just have a few questions, so that's exciting.
All right.
So
Well, I want to just take a moment here. We started off the hour like having you do the pitch session on CompTIA, but you want to get back on the stump for a second? What
sure.
give us the CompTIA latest greatest mission here,
The latest greatest mission. Well, the
or the
latest greatest
Trustmark
mission.
pitch, or both.
Yeah, I think I'm probably more equipped to do the Trustmark pitch, which
Let's
is
do it.
if you don't have currently as an MSP a path where cyber hygiene is a priority. Obviously, that needs to change. And I would argue that within the cybersecurity trust mark, there is a focus to have it be something that you do as part of a journey together with other MSPs and the vendors, as opposed to tackling the cybersecurity trust mark or any framework on your own. So, if I was to give any real guidance or suggestions, is like, hey, find somebody to do this journey with, because, well, a journey together is an adventure. A journey alone is a nightmare.
Well, and we have the readiness group, right? So if you don't have
We
someone
do.
with, all you got to do is raise your hand and go. We'll connect you with the cohort.
Yeah, and we're seeing that grow, right? So there's that through the MSP Ignite has peer groups around it. I just saw that Tech Degenerates has a weekly Thursday office hours for those that are participating in the Trustmark, and it's continuing to grow. So this is growing arms and legs that go beyond what CompTIA can do on their own. Again, that journey together with others makes for an adventure, and I would say this is a far cry from where we were a year and a half ago.
All right. Well, I think I might take us out of here, but before we do that, any takeaways on 8.1?
I'll just say this. I think it's really important that they labeled governance, and that should really help a lot of MSPs, I think, who kind of glazed over or even potentially skipped it. And to remember that most of the governance categories, so things like documentation, they largely fall into IG1. So, like, yay, you can go turn on DHCP logging, but like, it's asking you to have a plan in place, a program in place before you jump to the techie side. So, I think that was a super big value add for me, was just recognizing like, yeah, I understood like, hey, first have a plan. Like, but when you put the language to and say documentation and governance and you really reinforce that, it highlights the importance of those specific things. So
All right.
that's what
I agree. I think that's the most important takeaway, but I'm going to offer a different one just for diversity's
okay,
sake here.
fair.
They assetized people. Okay. So yes,
Yeah, yeah,
they assetized documents, artifacts, right?
Right.
Plans, governance, but they also asset people, and there were people in there before, but now there's an official remit to keep track of all your people
Yeah.
and their
Yeah.
identities and making sure they are who they should be, right? And I think that was really an important step to say, like, look, if you don't have your handle on this, you're missing a whole chunk of security.
To be fair, it was there before. It just really wasn't, the weight wasn't on it, right? Like it
Yeah,
just, it was very techy and like, using very generic language around what we all knew was being implied, but without ever saying people.
yeah. All right. Well, next week, back on the roundtable, 3 secrets to scaling your MSP with Mr. Joe Rojas from Stark Grow Manage. That'll be next Friday, 2:30 Eastern time.
Awesome.
CJ,
Yeah.
see you soon, man.
All right. Sounds good. Appreciate it as
Bye,
always.
everyone.
Bye.